In this video, we're going to cover off the planning and executing phases or processes of project management. To begin with, we want to look at our project breakdown. So we've defined the problem, we've defined the project, we've defined the scope. Now we want to actually start breaking that down into something we can work with. So in project management, we'd call this the work breakdown structure, but we'll also just refer to this as project breakdown. The first thing we want to do is we want to come up with our key deliverables. So what are our key deliverables to come up with? What are our key components of this project? If we're looking at implementing new software to automate some form in our supply chain, what we might want to look at as key deliverables are finding a vendor. We might want to look at uploading data as a key deliverable, those types of things. From there, we take those key deliverables and we'll break them into sub-deliverables. So if one of our key deliverables is finding a software vendor, our sub-deliverable might be shortlisting the vendors. From there, we look at work packages, and this is where the actual activity is going to take place. Now, I mean, shortlisting key vendors probably sort of sounds like an actual activity, but when you talk about interviewing those vendors and so forth, that's really where you're getting into the work packages. Very large projects are going to have high numbers of sub-deliverables, and they might even have sub-deliverable and then work packages. For these types of projects, we probably have one sub-deliverable or probably three layers. So the deliverable, the sub-deliverable, and the work package. But again, that's all going to be relative to the size of the project itself. So with these work packages and all of that figured out, what we want to do is we want to list this out, and I'll typically combine a Gantt chart with my work breakdown structure, but I'll add a column to my work breakdown structure or my project breakdown where I've got these work packages, and I'll assign my resources and my constraints, and I'll put a note or two about the resource or the constraint next to the work package. I'll typically also assign one person responsible for that particular work package as well. So within the resources, things that we typically would look at would be human resources, facilities, and equipment. One of the things that we can start to look at here is that if we have to make use of IT resources, as we start to lay out these work packages, it'll help us with our scheduling down the road as to when we're going to schedule which particular work package in order to make use of our IT function properly. Constraints are the other component here. We talked about constraints before when we talked about priorities, being scope, time, and cost. What I like to do with my work packages are note what my primary constraints are going to be for that particular work package. Ideally, based on the priorities that we set earlier, but they may be specific to that particular work package. So note all that. I like to use Excel, but you can use any sort of spreadsheet based to do this, but we'll also build out our Gantt chart from here as well using this setup already. With your work packages now identified, and as I said, I like to set those up on a spreadsheet so that I can usually use my Gantt chart or build a Gantt chart out to the right of those. I want to set it up so that I can then take my budget for the particular work packages and stretch it out over the course of time that those work packages are going to be done over. So if it's 5 weeks for a particular work package, and I'm going to spend $5,000 on that work package, maybe it's $1,000 each week, maybe it's $3,000 the first week and then $500 a week after that. But it's important to try to allocate, where possible, that budget across the work packages across weeks. This is considered a time-phased budget. What this allows you to do is when you're monitoring the project down the road and you're looking for cost variances and time variances, it actually allows you to distinguish between a time variance and a cost variance. Without doing a time-phased budget, you wouldn't necessarily know if you're behind schedule time-wise or cost-wise, or where you're really at. So time phased really helps us as we're monitoring the projects as they go forward. So with that said, we talked a little bit about high-level estimates of costs when we looked at doing the when we looked at doing the business case. We have to come up with some level of estimate. With those estimates, they would be a high level of detail, or they would be a high level estimate. Thus being maybe somebody's guess at it. You're talking typically plus or minus 50 to 100% in those estimates. When we start looking at planning out the projects at this time phased budget kind of level, we want a more detailed budget. We typically would be looking at functional area staff and managers to help us with those details. We may look at other projects that are similar and refine specifically what that particular work package is going to cost. So a little bit more effort is done into the budgeting at this level, and we're trying to get these within plus or minus 10% kind of budgets. All right, so we've got our time phase budget laid out. We've got our detailed estimates that we use to come up with that time phase budget. Now we want to actually talk about how do we figure out variances within our project. Now, this is assuming that we're going further. We've partly completed the project, and we want to decide whether or not we're on time, on budget. Where are we at with the project? So we want to look at a few different things here. And there is going to be a cheat sheet of formulas sent out as part of this session as well, but I'll briefly go over some of these at this point. One thing we want to look at is planned value. Planned value is what the budget would be at that time. So if I'm 6 months into a 12-month budget or 12-month project, and I've spent and the overall baseline budget of the project is $100,000, then I'm going to say that my planned value, or my PV, is $50,000. So that's planned value. It's based on time. Earned value, however, is a little different. Earned value is based on the actual work completed. If you look at the above, and although you are 6 months through that project, you look at the work that's completed and you only feel that you're 40% complete the work, then your earned value would actually be $40,000. So planned value based on time, earned value based on the work completed. Actual costs are the actual cost you have spent to that date, regardless of the work done. So we then look at schedule variance, and schedule variance is calculated by subtracting your planned value from your earned value. In the above case, the schedule variance would be negative $10,000, meaning you are behind schedule. Cost variance is calculated by subtracting actual costs from earned value. If this is positive, you are under budget, on budget at zero, and negative, you're over budget. So we have our cost and our schedule variance. If you want to look at that a little bit different, and some people like their indexes because they're pretty easy and pretty quick to look at, you might want to look at these in terms of performance indexes instead. So a schedule performance index is calculated simply by taking your earned value, or your EV, divide it by your planned value. With greater than 1, meaning that you've done more work than originally planned. Less than 1, you've done less work than originally planned. Similarly, cost performance index, your CPI, is your earned value divided by your actual cost. With greater than 1 being project is under budget, and less than 1 project is over budget. One of the most common questions that you'll be asked, or if you're the one sponsoring or the benefit of the project that you should be asking is the project on schedule and on budget? And if not, how much more time and how much more money needs to be spent in order for it to be finished? A way of calculating that, or one of the things that we want to calculate, is what's our total estimate at completion. So it's kind of like a revised budget based on being partway through the project. Our estimate at completion is going to be our actual costs plus our baseline budget less our earned value, and you take that and you divide that by the product of our cost performance index and our schedule performance index. and that'll give us our new estimate at completion. If you want to know how much more money you're going to spend, you take your estimate at completion and you subtract off your actual cost, and that's how much more money you're going to have to spend on that particular project. That's important because keeping your stakeholders, particularly people like CEOs and others that are in charge of the project, or at least have a direct relationship with the success of the project, keeping them informed of where you're at with your budget should be a priority of yours. They typically will care about where you're at in terms of spending and budget and so forth, especially when you're dealing with very time-sensitive kinds of projects. So what I would typically recommend is that once a project is underway, you do a weekly or a monthly, depending on how long the project is, status report that includes your cost and your schedule performance indexes, probably your cost and schedule variances, and then your estimate at completion at very least, and how is that changing. You probably want to put this on one page, and if at all possible, visually represent these kinds of things to help show your stakeholders where you're at. As you're working through a project, you'll run into situations where things aren't necessarily going as planned, and you'll start going back and looking at the different constraints that are involved. So when you're dealing with a time constraint, so the time has to be kept into mind, or I guess very clearly the project has to finish on time, there are a few ways of dealing with this. Number one, you can increase your costs by bringing in overtime, bringing in more resources and so forth. Number two, you can reduce your scope. So reduce the actual outcome or output of the project overall. So to deal with the time constraint, you're going to increase your cost or you're going to reduce your scope. That's why it's important to identify your priorities early on in the project so that when you're faced with these decisions that you need to make, you can actually choose what you're going to do. When you're dealing with a cost constraint, this can be a little bit more challenging because typically what we have is if we have to come in on cost or on budget, we may have to increase our time or reduce our scope. But keep in mind that the minute you increase your time, there are two components of cost: your direct costs of doing certain tasks and your indirect costs, such as overhead. And by increasing your time, you may trigger additional overhead, so you have to watch that. When everything is focused on the scope, so no matter what, your scope has to come in. You have to deliver exactly what you've identified as your scope. Then you can always increase time or you can increase your costs by throwing more resources at it. But there again, it's important to have identified early on what is your priority number one, what is your priority number two, and so forth, so that you can choose which one of those two, time or cost, if you're looking after scope, you're going to increase. With that in mind, you may have an opportunity to crash projects. And this doesn't mean to scrap the project, it means to speed up certain elements of the project. When you went through and you identified your work packages, one of the things that you should also do is note the precedences within those work packages, meaning specifically what has to happen before that work package and what has to happen after that work package. I guess precedent would be just what happens to happen before that work package. You'd normally identify work packages with some sort of number scheme, and then you'd have a column for precedence as well. And in the template documents, then you'll see where that would be. But you look at those precedents and you figure out what's your critical path. And this critical path is the idea that there's a route of those work packages that you'll go through that you won't have any slack or you won't have any free time if you go through those packages. There's some packages that you'll have lots of free time. You can start them later, you can start them earlier, whatever the case is, but there is certain paths within that project that you have to follow the critical path on. When you're dealing with a critical path, there will be opportunity to get certain tasks or certain work packages done quicker, typically by increasing money spent on that. This is called crashing a project. You will want to crash your project so long as you're not creating more critical paths, increasing the sensitivity of a project, and so long as the cost to crash or reduce the time for that particular activity or the work package, as long as that is not more than the indirect or the overhead costs involved. So those are kind of the rules on crashing projects. I won't get too much further into crashing projects here, but it's something that you can definitely look up and see how other ways of handling it. Keep in mind with all of this that time is money, as the cliche goes. So always consider that you've got direct costs that you're trying to save, but by extending your time, you also have overhead costs. In addition to overhead costs, you have opportunity costs you may be running into as well. So always be aware of the variety of costs you have that are going on. Okay, so the project's underway. We're working away on the project. There's some things that you want to consider in terms of people and responsibilities. Number one thing you want to look at is your ongoing stakeholder management. Something that's very often the case is that when projects first get started, there's a lot of fanfare and you have a lot of stakeholders that are interested and they stay engaged and so forth. As the project goes on, you're 6 months into the project, 12 months into the project, you'll find that your stakeholder support or interest seems to wane a bit. So you may consider different ways of communicating with your stakeholders. One thing that you want to always consider and respect is their time. So try to keep your communications with them brief, but you may have to adjust how you communicate from email, in which case they may not be even reading the email 6 months or 12 months into a project, to very brief in-person or phone meetings to keep them updated. So just keep in mind that keeping people interested in stuff over the long term takes a bit of effort. As it relates to people and managing the project, I've said it before and I'll say it again, anytime you're assigning somebody or you've got a responsibility column, whether it's a risk register, whether it's work packages, whatever the case might be, really try to assign one person as the responsible person. As soon as you start assigning more than one person as the responsible one, you will find often that people will tend to shift responsibility or they won't take it quite as seriously. So if you can assign one person to any particular task, I've found that that often yields more success in terms of project management. Moving along in dealing with people, particularly in times of COVID-19, and really probably going forward, the idea of virtual teams is going to be more and more relevant. If you're talking about software implementation, if you're talking about designing robotics to help automate components of your supply chain, you're also probably dealing with people in different areas. You might be dealing with engineering firms in Calgary and suppliers in Germany, for example. So you're going to be dealing a lot in the sense of virtual teams, and for that matter, some of your suppliers effectively become partners as well, so you dub that kind of a virtual organization. Ways of enhancing success or trying to achieve more success or see more success when dealing in these virtual environments are increasing the frequency of meetings, although not necessarily making them longer meetings. I would actually argue don't make them longer meetings, but you might want to have a weekly meeting where it's a video conference, people see each other's faces, and just a check-in point. Everybody goes through, you take 10 minutes, and everybody goes through what they're working on for the next week. It helps people see what others are doing, which often is all that's needed. Another note on this is, when possible, do still try to have in-person meetings. Now, if you're talking about people scattered across the world, that might mean that you have a kickoff meeting might be an in-person meeting. It might mean 6 months in, you might have an in-person, but that usually also helps build that camaraderie that you'll get in kind of face-to-face teams. But in project management, particularly for these types of projects, virtual teams, virtual organizations become a very critical component to the success of the project. And by making sure that everybody's on the same page, will go a very long way. One of the components within managing people, and whether it's managing your own people or suppliers or vendors and so forth, are having strong negotiation skills. And there's a variety of different ways you can go about handling negotiation skills. But I would definitely encourage you to look into some courses on negotiating skills or do a bit of reading on negotiating skills. One of the key, or there's a couple key components to it. When you're negotiating, try to separate the people from the problem. You try to separate interests from the positions. You want to create win-win scenarios, especially in longer-term partnerships. You want to make sure that nobody feels cheated and that everybody feels like they've come out ahead. And then you want to really try to be objective within your negotiating. And sometimes these negotiations get a bit more emotional and personal, so sometimes that's a little bit hard, but really try to take a step back and keep in mind what the long-term goals of the organization are and really what are the objectives of everybody in play. In true supply chain management, we're trying to actually improve the profitability or the value to everybody within that supply chain by increasing the overall value to the supply chain. So long-term partnerships are a significant component of that. Thus, win-win scenarios are a significant component.